Welcome back to the Alts Podcast. I'm your host, Horacio Ruiz. We bring you industry leaders and creators to give their insights on the rapidly changing and exciting world of alternative assets. Opinions expressed on this podcast by the host and podcast guests are for informational purposes only and should not be considered investment advice. Podcast hosts and guests may maintain positions in the offerings discussed in this podcast. The intro song, Fishing for Pets, is written and composed by Alan Goldshire from his latest release, Live at the Lakeview Lounge. Hey guys, thank you for joining me on the podcast. Today I got to talk to Kristian Kielhofner, the founder and CEO of Tovera, which uses proprietary technology to verify digital content. Kristian recently launched Fight NFT Fraud on fnftf.io, giving users the opportunity to quickly determine if an NFT is authentic or not. We talk about so much in here, from Kristian's personal journey as an entrepreneur to doing detective work to solve a bug on his servers, and his thoughts on the dangers of unchecked fraud in the Web3 space. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Kristian. Yeah, Kristian, so I was just looking at the website Tovera, and I guess my big question was, how big is Tovera? Kind of what is the scope that you're covering? Because I really like what you're doing in terms of fighting these fraudulent NFTs. But I know you talked about also like physical, digital collectibles, digital items, and kind of how much does that span? What are we talking about beyond NFTs?
Sure. So, we're really long-term believers in the Web3 ecosystem and, a lot of the promises and benefits that will likely, come as a result of its continued development and emergence. And, in terms of NFTs, we really see them as essentially being kind of merely, not to minimize them, but to kind of, as merely like the first application of content in the entire Web3 space. So this is why, while we have FNFTF and products like Tovera Match and such, we really like to put the emphasis on our focus in building a platform for all types of content and all types of application across the entire Web3 space, in which NFTs are really just the first example of that.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about fraudulent things, what's been in the news a lot, and I don't know if you've been following along, are these huge phishing scams. And I'm wondering, and I'm going to get into your fnftf.io and all that, but I'm wondering, is there a way where you can almost inspect, like you're doing with NFTs, inspect a link, put that link in a browser somewhere, right, where I could do a search and be like, beware, do not open this link. Is that kind of where we're headed?
Yeah. It's actually it's funny you mentioned that. It's almost like we actually coordinated and planned this. So where Tovera started was really a solution more akin to what you're describing. So we started with a proactive verification, authentication, and provenance solution that essentially associated the original creator of the work with a permanent embedding in the actual digital asset itself, so that regardless of whether it was minted on a given chain, a given marketplace, shared on social media, Web 2, Web 3 does not matter, because that provenance was associated with the asset itself and not one particular blockchain or social media network or whatever. And so we really consider Tovera Assure, the solution that I'm describing, to really kind of be our marquee flagship product. But what we, as is often the case with startups, what we very quickly realized is this is all well and good for new content prior to release. But what about the hundreds of millions, if not billions or trillions of pieces of content that are already out there? And so Tovera Match was essentially developed in recognition of that to be essentially more of a kind of reactive approach as opposed to a proactive one like what we have with Tovera Assure.
Yeah. You have a real interesting background, kind of leading back. I know you haven't always necessarily been in the NFT space. Not that the space is very old anyway, but I'm kind of curious I'm kind of curious what led you into this space. What led you into developing Tovera, And what are your thoughts? Kind of like, what do you as a guy who's been in technology for a while now, for your entire career, really? Um, what do you see about Web3, and what is it that excited you to jump into it?
Sure. So, depending on how far back we want to go, because as you noted, there's not much distinction for me personally between, my life and my career. I've been a, hardcore, essentially technology enthusiast since I was 5 or 6 years old. And I just kind of figured out, somewhere in the 90s, oh, well, it turns out that this is actually a pretty good area to get into. And people can, sorry.
Yeah, no. I want you, like, what does that look like? What does a 5, 6 year old, 10, 11, 12 year old look like when they're in technology? I mean, what was that like? You know?
Yeah, so I got really lucky. So neither of my parents are especially technical, but my dad was a university professor and author, and so it turns out that even though he's in the medical field, publishers of like books that used to get shipped around, they were pretty early adopters of technology because they quickly realized, well, wait a minute. I can remember far back enough to where if he's passing, essentially like a manuscript or drafts around with his editor, it was hundreds of pages in a FedEx box that they were shipping around.
Yeah.
And then, they finally realized, oh, well, for $5,000 in 1988 money or whatever, which is a tremendous sum, right? You can essentially run word processing or whatever, and we can, if nothing else, go from FedEx boxes of hundreds of pages to a FedEx envelope with a floppy disk of some kind in it. Mm-hmm. So already that was just this like tremendous advancement, in his field. And then, so he was at the University of Illinois, which, as many may know, is at Urbana-Champaign, kind of a top 5 engineering program for computer science and whatever. So they're certainly extremely early adopters of IP. I mean, this is where Mosaic came from. This is where the National Center for Supercomputing Applications is. So they were very, very early adopters in terms of, email, internet, all of those kinds of things. So that sort of period between, mailing floppies around was very short, because almost immediately after that, it turned into, well, attach the document to an email. And then this really blew people's minds, yeah. Right? Yeah. And so it was because of that, even though my parents aren't particularly technical, we had a computer in the house and we had the internet long before the average person. And so I essentially started off as, many do. I can remember being, probably even younger than 5 or 6, like maybe 4 or something. And, asking my dad, like, oh, well, what's the command to start Choplifter on our Apple IIe or whatever it was, some video game or something. And so it was like, at the time, this is like pre GUI and everything else. I was already, in a little deeper than most would be considering as the late 1980s.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I have recollections of that. My parents just having like these games, and they were all black and white, and I don't know, they were just kind of like the car was running like a race car game, and the car was just going left and right very slowly, and I remember that. I didn't get into the technical side as much. I just remember them having a computer. I was like, what is this? And you kind of made a career for yourself, right? With Linux now, kind of like, there you made I know you kind of were in the news. Not that you're a big break. You had started a company already, but you kind of gained some spotlight because you discovered this bug that took you hundreds of hours. That was like shutting down a bunch of servers, and and that was really kind of like a remarkable kind of demonstration of patience on your part and kind of grit to find out what was causing these servers to shut down. And I kind of liken it to now, and I want you to talk about that, but I kind of liken it to now where you're solving a problem, right? You see a problem and you're kind of like doing the detective work to find out what's the root cause of it. But I was wondering if you could talk about that, and then we could jump back into Tovera,
Sure, sure. So I think I might actually be able to make a, draw like a connection of some kind between, like my childhood and what was going on there. So, real quickly, then the next kind of big leap was I was touring, the University of Illinois campus. I was kind of like an obnoxious, 10 or 11-year-old, and I was just sort of running around all over the place. And I went into this, in the engineering school, I went into this room, and there was a bunch of, this is like the mid 90s. So these like ponytailed punk rock PhD students working on these computers. And I just like lit up. I thought, the kind of graphical interface, the command line, whatever they were using was nothing like I'd seen before. And so I just, ran up to one of them and I was like, how do I get this at my house? This is so cool. Whatever it is that you're doing, like, I want to get into that. How do I do that? And, he kind of laughed, because what I didn't understand at the time was, this was like a $200,000 Silicon Graphics Unix workstation, and there was no way I was getting one of these at home. But once they got done kind of laughing at me, another one of them leans over and he goes, "Well, what about that? What about that Linux thing? Like, Linux is like kind of a thing, right? I mean, that's sort of similar to this." And I went, "Yeah, Linux, great. I can run it at home, whatever it is." Like. And so, they told me, they're like, go down to the university bookstore, get a book. It's going to have a CD-ROM in it. Like, go install it on your computer. And sure enough, that day, that's exactly what we did. I begged and pleaded for my dad to, swing by the university bookstore. We got this book with the CD-ROM on it. And then I went home and I completely reformatted the family computer, like deleted all my sister's homework. I as far as my family was concerned, I just turned like a $3,000 computer in 1994 money into like a completely useless paperweight. And so, out of necessity, I'm thinking, oh man, this is a grounding minimum, right? It's like out of necessity, I'm thinking like, well, I need to get this computer functioning again. And now it's got Linux on it. I don't know where Windows went, but it's gone. So it's got Linux on it. I better get proficient in Linux very quickly. So even at that like 10, 11 years old, it was really a matter of like necessity or survival almost. So and at the time, there was just no way to make any use of these things without being very deeply technical. I mean, Linux at that point was, I think, maybe 3 or 4 years old. And it was rough. It was quite the beast to wrangle. So that's what really accelerated this sort of like, deep layer of technology that I like to get into. So, fast forwarding, let's go, a decade or so. So I ended up creating this embedded Linux distribution, which is, essentially like a packaged version of Linux. For voice over IP and firewalls and embedded devices. And it kind of did all these different things, which is, sort of starts the path of getting deeper and deeper and closer to the hardware and those kinds of things. And frankly, I had no idea, what I had on my hands. And sort of next thing I knew, I was, getting invited to speak and present at these conferences and, whatever else. And it was like at those conferences and those events, and we're now in like 2004 essentially. I ended up meeting what turned out to be my co-founders for Star Communications, and so we launched Star in 2006, and built and built and built. And it's, probably like a whole nother podcast of just the trials and tribulations and challenges of starting a startup from 3 people to 300 plus, wherever we ended up being in terms of headcount, at least. And we'd gotten to some scale and into, I think, what I could probably describe as like our 3rd or 4th generation of hardware that we were, putting in, installing at customer sites. Wow. And we started getting kind of these reports and rumblings of these tickets that were escalating from our support group. And it was one of these infamous, I don't know, something strange is happening, but like if we literally turn it off, unplug it, and plug it back in, it magically works again for some period of time. And what's, what I find interesting about these kinds of things is like, I think we all kind of experience these, this stuff in our daily lives of, I can't tell you how many times, I get in my car. I have no idea how cars work. I get in my car and I hit the button, and it turns on, and however that works, but like, oh, the LCD screen doesn't light up for some reason. It's like, okay, well, that's weird. So you turn the car off, you open the door, you wait a little while, you close the door, you turn it back on, and now like the screen works again, and you just sort of chalk that up to one of these, well, that was weird, but whatever, it works again, who cares, and you drive to the grocery store or whatever, right? And this was very much one of those where could not be reproduced. We could not figure out what was going on, but what we knew was it was happening in this very limited set of conditions or circumstances. But the problem is at scale, and especially given our type of customer and the fact that we handle 911 calls. I mean, the reality is, if between this bug manifesting itself and some every 1 out of 10 million whatever, and somebody having to unplug this thing and plug it back in, like someone could die if a 911 call doesn't go through. So, and you start to look at tens of thousands of these with the greater volume, as freak of an occurrence as it is, if it happens like 1% of the time, that's still a very big number in the grand scheme of things. So once it became clear that there was something going on here, I kicked off this project that that led to the Wire story and whatever else to really dig in and figure out what is going on here. This is such a strange issue. And long story short, it ended up being a bug in, and I'll never forget this because, to your point, there's a lot of time spent on this. It was a bug in the Intel 82574L Ethernet controller EEPROM. So it was this, and it was one of these things like, any sufficiently advanced technology is indiscernible from magic. And even for, like in my lifetime, I'd been very deep in various layers of the stack. And so I knew that, Ethernet controllers, kernel, physical layer working on up. I knew that there was an EEPROM there, but I didn't really kind of understand what it did because it never mattered. It always worked, except for now it's not. And there's something going on here. And so long story short, this is already a long story, but anyway, to try to wrap it up, it ended up being a very, very, very specific Ethernet packet configuration with just the right byte at just the right location that triggered this bug in the EEPROM and shut the controller down. So that's why only when you pulled the power out did it fully reset, and it would reinitialize itself properly. But it was just a matter of time until, in millions and millions and millions of packets, until another packet came along with that one in tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions, whatever it was, that the tiny infinitesimal chance that you'd have that specific value at that specific offset or byte range. And so chased it down, isolated that, identified kind of the issue, and then developed a patch to the Intel EEPROM to fix it. So that's that story. That's what happened there.
When you describe it, it's obvious how much time and how much patience you had to have to figure that out. And I just found that detective work so curious, and it's out of my realm. I have no idea exactly. You described it very well, but to kind of see it is to me remarkable when you solve something like that. I'm interested in then. You mentioned that the company grew to 300 people. You had 300 people working for you. Obviously, you had a great deal of success, and you sold off part. I don't know if you guys sold the company or sold your share of the company. But why did you decide to move on? What was the impetus for that?
Sure. So the entire company was acquired last year. The transaction closed April 1st for roughly $400 million, something kind of in that range. Yeah. So yeah, thank you. So the interesting thing was, and even kind of the head count, right? And not to wax philosophical too much, but looking back, I distinctly remember these moments in a startup where it was originally, your first like 10 people, you know who they are, you know everything about them, you've met their kids, you've met their wives, like, you're like in the trenches all day, every day. You're basically eating 3 meals, a day together. Yeah. And you can get everybody in the same room and you could go, okay, we're doing this, whatever. And, it's just like a huddle essentially on a field, right? And then you get to 20, you can't really do that anymore. And, and then you start getting into like 50, and now it's borderline, well, I'm not even really sure who some of these people are or what they do, right? And it's not a matter of of necessarily being like indifferent. It just kind of gets to a point where you just sort of really can't keep track. And then you get to like 100, 200, whatever, and then it's like you get surprised when you pass one of the original 10 in a hallway somewhere. Like, oh, hey, Sean, how's it going? I haven't seen you in a while. So as I'm back at Tovera, kind of, starting from 1, 2, 3, a handful again, I always like to kind of think of these journeys.
Yeah.
And so kind of in line with that headcount growing, realized essentially in probably like the, almost sort of 10 years in, like the 2015, 2016 timeline, essentially was like, oh, well, this is not absolutely everything technical comes down to me anymore. This is not a 16, 18 hour a day, everyday job anymore, essentially. I actually have some time to look into other things and maybe get back to, just like I did when I was a little kid, just sort of like, what's neat, what's interesting, let's play with some stuff. And, like a lot of, just kind of nerdy people, I've been following, Bitcoin, blockchain, what have you, since the very beginning, 09, 10, et cetera. But I was just like, I was in it. I was doing things like tracing down Intel Ethernet controller bugs for hundreds of hours at a time. Doesn't leave much time or energy for, going deep into blockchain or whatever else you think is cool, right? It's like, oh, this is, like I was saying, it's like, if I get a story of a 911 call not going through, I mean, I'm going to be devastated, right? If nothing else. So anyway, we'd matured beyond that level of like daily intense involvement for me personally by about the 2016-ish timeframe. And so I thought, all right, this is a great opportunity to really get into this blockchain thing that I've been so fascinated with for all of these years. And as you could likely gather, or anyone watching or listening could gather, like, for me, the guy that was in the weeds of a Ethernet controller or whatever, I like to sort of look at things in layers and understand the stack, at least to some level. And so for getting into blockchain, what that meant to me was, oh well, of course, I'm going to go out and get my hands on 200 GPUs, and I'm going to start mining, Ethereum or Zcash or what, kind of whatever it was. And so my first foray into blockchain ended up going live like early 2017. And that was this like, sort of mid-sized, cryptocurrency mining operation of sorts that then led to running my own blockchain nodes and writing smart contracts and doing all of those kinds of things. So, with the sale of Star to Star last year, I had known for years that whatever I did next would be something blockchain related.
Yeah.
And once the company sold and I was essentially, completely free and clear to really start from the beginning and go all in on something else, that was the birth of Tovera.
That was the birth of Tovera. Let me ask you, I mean, and I know this is kind of like maybe it's a silly question, but I mean, is there anybody in tech, right, prior to say 2010, 2009, that isn't somehow see blockchain or see the promise in blockchain? I feel like it's almost like the natural progression, right? For everybody that saw the promise of the internet and kind of this open model connecting the world, right? I mean, it's almost like the natural progression, right? It almost seems like this blockchain is just the next phase of tech, and there's really nobody saying no, 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 this is not the way, right? I mean, it's kind of so obvious. Or is that just me?
So this is something that I've kind of been fascinated with. So, with getting really deep in this technology, also, of course, came like, getting really deep in, like various online communities and corners of the internet and, whatever it may be. And it's actually been really interesting, as best as I can tell. And I'm not some like sociologist or psychologist or whatever, but there seems to be sort of like an interesting distribution of, like, if I were to kind of put it into like three buckets. Generally, you have the Bitcoin maxis. They're kind of typically described as, right, where it's just like, no matter what happens, this is good for Bitcoin. This is good for blockchain. Blockchain is going to take over the entire universe. And, within 6 months, everything is going to be somewhat chain related, and Web3 is just going to completely take over. And if you don't get that and you're not on board with me, like, you're out of touch and you're irrelevant. So, you have the spectrum, like that's one extreme. Yeah. Then you have people that are probably like me. They're sort of a little closer to the middle, that have been around a little bit longer, where, like, I'm not such a cranky old man that I just like shut down any new idea. But I've also seen multiple comings and goings of like the next big thing, and successes and failures in a over the span of 30 years or however long it's been. Yeah. So I'm sort of in this weird middle place where I look at this and I go, well, I've gotten as deep into this technology as almost anybody, and I've been at it for 5 years. Clearly, I believe in this, and I think it's a very interesting technology. I think it has all kinds of fantastic real world use cases and applications that are, like, to your point, like the kinds of shifts, not to draw a direct comparison, but the kinds of shifts that I saw in the 90s with, it went from, I would be at my dad's university and they're the only people that knew anything about the internet, to like the cool kids in middle school were on the internet. Right. Like watching that was like, oh, okay, this is really interesting. There's definitely something here. Right. And so I think we're sort of in that stage of blockchain now, where it's still sort of kind of trying to find its rightful place, and we'll sort of see what shakes out, in terms of, kind of what makes sense, because it's very rare, virtually impossible, that there's like a, just sort of a silver bullet magical technology that just kind of solves all of the world's problems. It doesn't exist. It never has, and it never will. And, that's where I look at, some of these maximalists and I'm like, yes, of course it's very promising, but I don't know about some of that, but of course I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know. I'm just, basing it off of like, my experience and my opinion. But then you also have, on the other extreme side of the spectrum, you have people who are just absolutely convinced that every single, the technology sucks. It doesn't work. It never will work. No matter how much time or money gets poured into it, it does not matter. It's fundamentally broken. And oh, by the way, anything based on a cryptocurrency or a token is a complete Ponzi scheme, and you're all a bunch of criminals. And by the way, you're, proof of work, you're destroying the planet while you're at it, kind of type of thing. So, and these like, not necessarily those in the, and I'm not exaggerating. I mean, I'm serious. I see this every single day. Yeah. And, there are, as best as I can tell, very few people in my camp who are able to, like, I've got bias just like anybody else does, right? But I feel like I'm fairly rationally able to sort of like objectively view this, look at data, analyze the data, adoption numbers, rates, whatever, like one technology versus the other, whatever it is. And I'm probably in the extreme minority of being able to, as best as I can tell, of having kind of a, relatively emotionless, fact-based observation and assessment of kind of the current state of things. and then the two sides either side of me, it's essentially religious. It's like it gets into that level of fervor where if you see some of this dialogue online, it is just opposite wings, people screaming at each other of, as a level of discourse for like, you're a bunch of fraudsters and scammers and criminals. And then it's you're dinosaurs and you're out of touch and you don't get it. Ha 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 ha.
Yeah.
So they're really, it's been really interesting to sort of watch this, even in the time that I've been in very, very deep over the past 5 years or so, that as best as I can understand it, that generally seems to be the landscape.
Yeah. And that's very well put. It's still this discourse, right? That, and you don't necessarily want there to be a winner or a loser. You want there to kind of be some sort of middle ground, as with anything. Let's go.
Yeah, and I guess to kind of finish up my soapbox rant there, it's essentially like, well, why can't we acknowledge that there isn't a hammer for every nail, there isn't a silver bullet. I mean, just like today, it's like, hey, you've got Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, WhatsApp, TikTok, and there are people that are, more or less kind of really ingrained or committed to one of them, but they all serve slightly different purposes for slightly different needs for slightly different groups of users. And then you've also got people using them across the board for their slightly different use cases, right? And, you've got, let's call it like, to be fair, sort of like approximately half the world thinks Android is a better mobile platform, and the other half of the world thinks that iOS is a better mobile platform. And it's like, hey, if one works better for you for whatever reason, absolutely, like go with that. Go with the best tool for the job. And so I think that's kind of the problem that, is sort of defining these two camps, where it's like you have one camp that's convinced it is the best tool for every and any job. And then you have the other camp convinced that it's completely useless and it's not the right tool for anything.
Yeah. Yeah. And that that there's no, I guess, stuck with the status quo, right? Like, why change it if it ain't broke? But the thing is, it's kind of broke.
Yeah.
In some, in a lot of ways we could talk, but that's like, get into economics and finance and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
With Tovera, and we talked about this earlier today, and I kind of want to get into the fight NFT fraud. You had a release a couple of weeks ago, and my big question, I mean, it's a simple question, but why start there, right? Why? And I want to get into the program and how it works a little bit, but what did you see? What did you see in talking to platforms or other, developers or creators about that problem with NFTs and the fraud around that space?
So going back to the real original genesis of Tovera, sort of like mid last year, I'd been following, again, kind of from like a deep tech standpoint, all of these different emerging standards and whatever else. And 2021, for kind of lack of a better term, certainly in the cryptocurrency community, the blockchain community, could certainly be summed up as the year of the NFT. I mean, it's where, NFTs really exploded on the scene. And, I looked at this and having, a deep understanding of how this technology fundamentally works, I knew this entire time, hey, an NFT does not communicate the kind of authenticity, verification, and provenance that people think it does. There are some pretty significant, fundamental limitations that may be blockchain based or storage based or whatever it is. And it's looking like this, this is like kind of starting to go somewhere. So I'm going to essentially place a bet that sooner or later, people are going to realize that there are some bad actors and opportunists that have identified the same holes that I have, and they're going to take advantage of them and they're going to exploit them. I'm going to essentially put my time and energy and whatever else in essentially hoping that I meet them at some point here in the future. So that's where sort of this like the cross chain additional layers of verification and provenance to plug those holes came from in terms of Tovera Assure. And then Tovera Match was, again, this is like this recognition of, okay, well, we already have hundreds of millions of pieces of content, or whatever it is. What are we going to do about that? And what we discovered, whether it was talking to potential investors or customers or creators or consumers or collectors, even though certainly this year awareness of some level of NFT fraud or forgery, whatever it may be, has been increasing. Kind of like my story with the car, most people don't understand how these things work, and they shouldn't. Like, who cares? I don't understand how a lot of things work. Mm-hmm. But it was it's because of kind of some of those those fundamental misunderstandings that this NFT fraud issue has persisted. So we launched FNFTF to really be able to go essentially to end users, however you'd like to characterize them, whether they be the kind of content creator side of a given marketplace or a platform, or the consumer or collector side of a given marketplace or platform. And if nothing else, make it available as an educational tool. I mean, there's a reason why when you go to fnftf.io and you click the most prominent button, which is show me a random ape, what goes on there is literally like there's a random number generator that takes one of the 10,000 apes and just does a search. Like I haven't manually searched them. I haven't manually reviewed all the results. But what I do know is that, apes are so prominent clearly that you basically cannot get a random search of an ape without having like at least a half a dozen incidents of fraud or forgery. And in many cases, it's a multiple of that. I mean, like, there are some that we've observed that are 25, 30, 40, 50, either copies of an ape, an invalid derivative, a non-authorized derivative, whatever it may be. So that was, that's kind of really the background and the genesis on the launch of FNFTF and providing, FNFTF that's powered by Tovera Match to the public at large, to, of course, demonstrate our capabilities and what we have from a technology standpoint, but also to bring attention to some of these issues that we've long identified, and also just the scope and the scale of the problem at hand. That we've seen in many cases that maybe as many or 30 something like 30 to 40% of all of the NFTs that we have indexed are unoriginal, are fraud or forgery. And that's just an incredible number.
That is an incredible number. And I'm thinking, I spoke to Cameron Hijazi from Cent, and he brought up the time when he had the marketplace for, not for the tweets, but for just the general marketplace, and people were trying to sell off rip off apes there. And it became so bad. He said, he came out and said it was like 80-85% of the NFTs there were fraudulent. And I'm kind of wondering, and so we talked about bringing that marketplace back up. He talked about it, bringing it back up. I asked him questions about it, and he says he wants to do it, but with these guardrails, right? Where either they can do something on the front end before the NFTs even get out into the marketplace, or at the very least where, like you mentioned before, consumers can do the check, for themselves. Do you find that's, are you aware kind of like what Cameron went through a little bit? And, is that kind of what, in a small way, FNFTF can do, for a platform like Cent, where they can help the company or the consumers?
Absolutely. So, first, we've been working at this for some time, and I had not met Cameron previously, and I caught some of the media attention that Cameron and the rest of the team at Cent had received, and I immediately reached out to him and I said, hey, first and foremost, if nothing else, I am in deep awe and respect and commend you for what had to be an extremely difficult decision to essentially put your business, your company, and your baby on pause to do the right thing, to do the honorable and ethical, to make that decision to say, hey, you know what? We're seeing a lot of incidents of fraud and forgery. And until we can somehow get our hands around this, like, we are not going to participate in this. This is not what we're about. And that's when they suspended listing and selling on Cent. It also led to a broader conversation, of course, of exactly to your point of what we're working on here with Tovera Match and FNFTF is to, throughout multiple workflows and different integrations and interactions, everything from to go through an existing catalog to identify any potential fraud or forgery that you already have and take some action against it, to let's put this thing up at the front, and before we allow content to be listed or added to the marketplace, let's run it past Tovera Match and let's see what Tovera Match has to say about this. So kind of one of the analogies I make is unfortunately most NFT marketplaces at this point in time are essentially a building with a gigantic sign out front and some a neon billboard that says like, fraud and forgery bad actors, come on in, right? And so what we're saying here is, even in the early stages of Tovera Match, it's like, okay, first things first, turn that sign off, close the front door, and put a couple of deadbolts on it. And so that's kind of the it's like kind of the analogy that I like to make, and I think a good one for the approach that we're taking, in that practically speaking, what happens here with Tovera Match is, in a hypothetical situation with a marketplace, you could essentially say, okay, you create your account, whether we do know your customer or not, doesn't really matter. You create your account, and when you submit content to our marketplace to list it, in the back end, it's invisible to the creator or the uploader. We're going to take that actual media and we're going to send it over to Tovera Match. And Tovera Match is essentially going to give us something maybe akin to a credit score, however you'd like to think about it. And we can tell them any number of things from, hey, you know what? This is a 100% copy of an ape that was minted a year ago. Mm-hmm. And from there to, hey, you know what? 45% of the pixels of this image match this. And maybe you want to reject that or moderate it or do something, so there's this kind of like stoplight approach of 100% matches. I think anybody would look at that and say, yeah, that probably doesn't belong in a marketplace, right? And then there's kind of a yellow or gray, depending on how you want to look at it, area where, okay, maybe it's a little subjective. We need to kind of learn how we want to look at these results and decide what we want to do. And then there's essentially like the green of, ideally, if we take a step back and we look at what NFTs are really supposed to represent, it's uniqueness and scarcity. The entire value of one of 10,000 Bored Apes is completely tied to and associated with, there might be 10,000 variations of my ape, but my ape is my ape. It's completely original. I can look at it and I can say, that's mine. And anybody else can look at it and say, yes, that is yours. Or, you can look at one of the other 9,999 and know, like, that's something else. Yeah. And so ideally for good actors and original content creators in this marketplace use case, Tovera Match shouldn't know anything about it. We should come back and say, we've never seen anything like this before. We have no results, because that represents an original work that has not been seen by the blockchain before. And that is what an NFT is supposed to be.
Interesting. That's, um, you know, I think that the NFT piece is huge, really, and I know it's a small piece of what Tovera Match is doing. You know, you start kind of starting it off with the NFTs, and you have a much kind of bigger plane, right? So I kind of want to
Mhm.
talk about that as we kind of come up on our time here a little bit, Kristian. You know, um, what I think of now in terms of like fraud, is like big picture stuff, disinformation, right? Deep fakes, altered photographs, things like that, right?
Mhm.
Where people are, they're getting their news from Facebook, they're taking it as fact, and they're creating their opinions. They're kind of having these conversations based off of what they're seeing, and a lot of times what they're seeing is, altered material. Um, is that kind of where you're headed? I mean, that's kind of where my brain starts going beyond the NFT stuff.
So it's funny. That was actually the original spark for Tovera. As I was looking at kind of this like I'm free in April, I think it was March 13th of last year. I don't know if you caught this or not. There was a really interesting story of it was a mom in her mid 50s in actually a small town in Pennsylvania that I've been to before. That's kind of an interesting story, but I caught it. I was like, oh, Doylestown. I've been to Doylestown.
Yeah,
What's
yeah,
up
those
with
don't.
this? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the story was, just to kind of summarize it. This is a wild story. It was this, it was a mom in her mid 50s who was clearly way too engaged in her teenage daughter's cheerleading career, and she ended up creating rudimentary but deep fake videos nonetheless of her daughter's teenage, like high school cheerleading rivals engaging in all sorts of bad behavior in an attempt to discredit them and get them kicked off the cheerleading squad and improve her daughter's chances
Okay.
of making it on the cheerleading squad. Did you catch that?
I have vague recollections that, yes, it was something where you're like, this is too crazy. I'm not even, you read the headline and
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
kind of like,
It's like, what? And if it weren't for the fact that one of my best friends grew up in Doylestown, I may not have really paid that much, that close of attention to it. But I at least
yeah,
send it to him, and I'm like, hey, do you see what's going on in Doylestown these days? What's up with that? But it was this like really interesting moment of, well, I'm also, just being so interested in technology. I've been following deepfake technology progression for years as well. But are we approaching a point in time where, not to be, ageist or pick on cheerleading moms, but it was like, this person is closer in age to my mom, who's not technically sophisticated at all than I am. And she's aware of deep fakes and is able to make use of some sort of tool to generate something, however rudimentary. Are we approaching a point in time where, between an advancement in the fundamental technologies, the advancement in compute hardware, Moore's law, leveraging of cloud, blah, 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 all these things, are we approaching a point in time where anyone is going to be able to install an app on their iPhone and generate a completely perfect, indiscernible deepfake video of anyone doing or saying anything? And I think the answer is yes. On a long enough timeline, like, but we're going to get there
scary.
eventually, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it's like, we're not even talking about, Russia or nation state actors or North Korea or, the United States and the NSA or whatever. We're at a point where a year ago, a lady from Doylestown was making deep fakes. Like, this is not.
One.
Yeah, yeah, a cheer mom. This is not the NSA, right? So, I thought, like, okay, and of course I did like another technical deep dive, right? And and realized that in the computer vision machine learning community, it's sort of a foregone conclusion that eventually the technology approaches to generating deepfake videos will win. It will get to a point where, right now, there's kind of an approach where, okay, well, maybe we'll develop a model and we try to detect them, whatever. But on a long enough timeline, the consensus is essentially that the generation of these things will get so good that they're indistinguishable to the human eye perception, and they're completely indistinguishable to another computer trying to detect these things. And so, I kind of looked at this and I thought, well, this is one of these, again, my kind of middle approach of blockchain is great for for tons of things. Like, oh, what if we had this like NFT plus plus media authentication and provenance that also created a validation record of that, whether it's an NFT or not, on a blockchain, so that whether media created by you or whatever is authenticated with Tovera Assure. It doesn't matter if like Putin or Kim Jong-un or whoever is after you, like it's on this globally distributed database that is 100% secure, that is cryptographically authenticated and cannot be changed or modified by anyone. And so it was like from the cheer mom in Doylestown colliding with the kind of ML stuff that I'd been into with the blockchain and whatever else. I thought, okay, in working on this at Tovera, we can potentially get ahead of and provide a authentication solution to counter the emerging threat of deepfakes, while also simultaneously embracing NFTs and blockchain and sort of identifying and plugging these holes that I'd already identified in current approaches to NFTs more broadly and generally.
Yeah. It seems like, and maybe I'm unaware, but it seems like blockchain is really, at this point, the best solution for something like that, right? Because of what you had described before.
Absolutely.
It's, you can't corrupt it, it's distributed, and it's a global database, essentially. So that's really interesting, kind of like you got to be bullish on that. So with that in mind, I mean, with Tovera Match, I mean, what I want my listeners the listeners to do is definitely check out fnftf.io. It's a really cool site. I kind of dragged a couple of my NFTs into the JPEG search, and and it comes out and it says 100% match, which I'm like, great, yay. My NFTs that are worth now $10. But that's cool. And then I dragged other ones. Like I took like some copies, where I would drag them off of OpenSea, stick it into my desktop, and I would drag it onto the site, right? And then it comes out and it says like a 94% match or something like that, a pixel match. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, I guess, you don't want the 90, you really want 100%, right? I mean, if it's being verified through the blockchain.
So it depends. So the thing is, I'll try to, like I'm so highly technical, sometimes I just can't help but like get in there and even in conversation. So like, for example, if you take an NFT that's listed on OpenSea from like the gallery or the collection page, just the listing on OpenSea, that's already a thumbnail, and they've kind of done some things to it, like it's been resized or they've kind of recompressed it or whatever. So that's a case where when you take that and you submit it to FNFTF, like, you might get a 94, 95% match, which is interesting because it's, around like 90% is where like the human eye can start to tell the difference. So, one thing I'm very proud of in our implementation at, in Tovera Match is that the matching algorithm is sophisticated enough to be able to tell when an image has been recompressed or has been resized or whatever. And, a person doesn't have a chance at identifying that something's been done to that. And so what we did on FNFTF, where basically at the top of the search results, there's a timeline. Mm-hmm. And so left to right, there's all of the matches that get returned. And the image furthest to the left is the first record, the first match of that specific configuration of pixels, whatever you submitted. That's the first time any of the blockchains we have indexed have seen anything like it. So generally speaking, that is the real one. Mm-hmm. And so, if you look at like the contract details or whatever else, like if that lines up with what you have, then it's essentially a 100% lock for like, like you have an original versus, if you look, so it's like, let's say, the first ape that comes back was minted like May 21st of last year or whatever it is. Yeah. if if what you own or what you are looking, what you're, potentially purchasing is one of the copies from February of this year, well, clearly that's not the original, and you are looking at a fraud or a forgery of some type.
Amazing.
Yeah, and I'd also like to point out, I don't know if you saw this. So we also have a browser extension that's available in the Chrome Web Store, and if you install it and add it to Chrome, you can do 2-click searches directly from any of the dozen or so marketplaces that we support with the browser extension.
Yeah.
So it's literally like, from fnftf.io, there's a button that takes you to the Chrome Web Store. You install the extension, and seconds later, you can be on OpenSea, Maker's Place, Foundation, Coinbase NFT, any number of other NFT marketplaces. Right-click on an NFT image, click search on FNFTF, and the results open immediately.
Cool. No, I didn't see it, but that's really useful. I mean, really cool. And then I guess my last question, Kristian, and kind of leading back to our, what we were talking about just before, kind of who are the clients, like who are the people or the platforms that are looking to use this technology that you're developing, right? In terms of like fighting the deep fakes, are we talking about all these social media platforms, or is that something that you're still kind of trying to, preach the importance of? Or are the companies aware and they realize that they have a problem, or are you fighting that uphill battle?
So this is not necessarily new in terms of my technology startup career. It's a double-edged sword, essentially. Of like, the good news is you've got this like great solution, this great technology that's broadly applicable. The bad news is you're starting from zero, you're small, you're somewhat resource limited. It may apply in all of these different areas, but you have to pick something to focus on to better understand your user, their use case, the customer, what their needs are, the scope of the problem, all of those different things. And so in our, kind of even going back to some of the earliest questions of like, yes, it's this like massive database that can do these searches and these matches and whatever. The mind can just run endlessly on all of the different areas where this technology could apply and be useful. But luckily the bet that I made last year of bad actors are going to figure out that NFTs are not kind of what people think they are, and there's going to be a lot of fraud. And even on my most cynical day, I wouldn't have imagined that the fraud would have gotten this bad. So, yeah. I mean, it's unreal. Like Cameron, Cameron has said time and time again, it's unbelievable how bad it is.
Yeah.
So I think as in terms of a first application of the technology, certainly made a good bet there. In terms of use, like, who are these people, who would use this? So kind of, moving through sort of the pipeline of what the NFT ecosystem looks like. On one side, you have the creators, and first, for a variety of reasons, they want to know when their stuff gets stolen. They want to know when their work has been ripped off and when people are, stealing from them, quite literally, like taking money out of their pocket to move it to theirs. They also want to know, hey, these frauds are out there. I should let my users and my community know, here are the frauds. Here are my originals. Like, do not engage with these frauds at all, if nothing else, right? So that's kind of a very like simple, straightforward use case for the creator, and that's another one where like you described on fnftf.io today, a creator can take any piece of work that they have, and interestingly, whether they've made it an NFT or not, because there's this other fraud issue of bad actors in the NFT space stealing art that's existed for, in some cases, decades from Web 2, and making NFTs of them, presenting, passing themselves off as the original artist, when the original artist has no idea what an NFT is and has nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
So it's like whether you're that creator or you're a creator that has embraced the NFT ecosystem, whatever, you can drop your work into fnftf.io and we'll tell you like where it's ended up, who's stolen it, when, where, all of those different things. On the other side, you've got you as a collector, NFT investor, however you'd want to describe it. There's a big question. I mean, frankly, to me, it's kind of scary, borderline terrifying to think as we speak, somebody somewhere, I mean, like literally, as we speak, somebody somewhere just heard about NFTs and they're going to wander into a marketplace somewhere and they're going to potentially spend tens of thousands of dollars. And again, maybe at this point, given what's happened in the NFT space, $100, whatever, it doesn't matter. They're going to spend their hard-earned money on something where, if you look at the math, they've got at best a 50-50 shot of what they're buying, however you feel about NFTs, whatever, none of that matters. The reality is, if you buy a forged Picasso that somebody painted in their garage 2 weeks ago, it's worth nothing, right? Yeah. If you buy an original Picasso that, like he put his brush to the canvas, it's worth $10 million or whatever. So there are extremely high stakes in this space. It just so happens that, reproducing a Picasso on canvas and passing it off as a 100-year-old work is significantly more difficult than right-click, save as, re-upload of an NFT. Right.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, from the consumer or collector standpoint, and I'm not just saying this to be self-serving, but we really kind of see this as even to be dramatic, as a complete, total existential threat to at least the entire NFT space, if not the Web3 space, because how many stories, how many Twitter threads, how many whatever of, I got completely ripped off, I got completely scammed, I bought this fake, it's worth nothing, or somebody hijacked this from my wallet, or this is a rug pull, whatever it was, all these scams that we've seen. How many of those stories is it going to take before the rest of the 98% of the population that we're trying to bring into the fold in the blockchain, cryptocurrency, and Web3 space? How many of those stories are going to happen before the average person just writes this thing off as being a cesspool of fraud and criminality? So we think that that from an individual level to the entire ecosystem, the stakes are extremely high on providing solutions and tools to address a lot of the fraud and frankly criminality that goes on in the space every day.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to a broader issue about security, regulation. Even the laws, right, are kind of murky around NFTs and cryptocurrency. So if there's no laws, there's no regulations, really, right? The industry has to kind of look within and come up with some solutions, and that's kind of that's definitely what you're doing, Kristian. So it's a good step forward, because you're right. And I wrote about that a couple weeks ago in the news. Like, how much more does this need to happen before not only do people not come in, but then the people that are in the space have enough and they're fed up and they leave, So.
Oh, it's, imagine if in 1995, your first experience with e-commerce was, you put your credit card number into a website, you got completely ripped off, like nothing ever showed up. And then, oh, by the way, they ran up a bunch of charges on it. You would swear it off and say, yep, the internet's all a scam. It's just a bunch of thieves and robbers and bandits and criminals. And you'd never come back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Or at least a substantial portion of people would never come back.
No, for sure.
And so, that's where I see this as, like, one way or another, frankly, I, so engaged in this space and am such a long-term believer. It's like, hey, solutions like Tovera, whatever else. I mean, the reality is in this ecosystem, from user adoption and all these other factors, it's still really in its infancy.
Yeah.
And if we don't all collectively work together to essentially clean house and take care of some of these issues, everything that we're doing and everything that we're working on will continue to languish in relative obscurity because we weren't able to address these problems and these issues.
Absolutely. Kristian, thank you so much for your time. This was a great conversation, man. Everything from learning about you as a kid, to becoming the detective with Linux and just how you grew up around the technology. Really, really interesting stuff, man. And now talking about what you're up to now. So congratulations on the great success.
Thank you.
Now best of luck with your next project. Your next mission, I guess I could call it. Where can people keep track? Where can people keep up with you? Are you mostly on Twitter, LinkedIn? I know people like to follow the guests.
Yep. So Tovera is on Twitter at Tovera Inc. I'm at Kiel Chirps. I like to have verbs for my my various social media platforms, and then of course there's fnftf.io and Tovera.com, where you can sign up for our wait list, to basically be apprised of any new or interesting developments that we have going on here at Tovera.
Awesome. Kristian, thanks so much. Look forward to the developments, and hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Horacio, likewise. And, by the way, I may not have mentioned that, my dad was a professor at University of Illinois, Chicago, which is basically, right in the neighborhood of Comiskey.
Comiskey Park. Okay.
And so I love the Sox jersey.
I'm in New York. It's my kid's second favorite team.
Okay.
Because
fair enough.
It's I coach the little league team, so I'm getting ready for practice in an hour or so.
All right. Nice. Love it.
A big thanks to Kristian for coming on the podcast and for talking about the elephant in the room, the rampant amount of fraud that currently pollutes the NFT space. I really hope that Tovera plays a key role in helping secure digital content and keeping all the fraudsters away. As always, thank you for spending part of your day with us. If you enjoyed today's episode, let others know about it or leave a review or a comment. Until the next time, take care.